Hi, everyone. Welcome to another episode of the Decode podcast. And today's guest is Matthew Webster, founder, CEO, CISO at Cybersecurity. Hey, Matthew, how's it going?
It's going good. How about you?
Yeah, I'm very well, thanks. And for our audience, Matthew and I are acquainted through a mutual Slack channel. And obviously, I've been keeping an eye on Matthew's work. So I would definitely reach out and follow Matthew on LinkedIn. Some really good content out there. And yeah, someone in the industry that we should really be paying attention to. And then we'll dive right into the first question for Matthew then, and that's can you give me a brief overview of who you are and your career?
Sure. So I've been around the block, obviously. I'm not 20 years old. I just look that way. But I come up through the IT channels like a lot of people, doing a lot of the infrastructure stuff and some networking and things like that. And then I moved into government cybersecurity right away. So that was a huge, huge learning curve for me because when you're doing over here in the United States, we have NIST 853, which is a very tough compliance framework. I did that for many years. So I really cut my chops on compliance very early on and got to understand what is good security. And there's a lot of challenges within that industry, but there's a lot of good things that are coming out of it. And I definitely learned a lot going through that and understanding the controls, going through the details. And I see the value of that. I've brought that with me in different organizations, but it's something I'm very comfortable with. But eventually I did have a couple of sales roles, but so I'm used to looking at hundreds and hundreds of types of cybersecurity tools. So I'm pretty familiar with a lot of them. I brought them into various programs that I've worked with over the years. I have built many cybersecurity programs from the ground up. I've gotten into cyber insurance and cyber risk quantification and a whole host of different things. I've been amongst my CISO journey. One of the CISO roles I had was a global chief information security officer. So I had several different organizations reporting into me. And so that was an interesting challenge too. But I feel like everywhere I've gone, I've had an opportunity to grow and learn something that I didn't know before. So I'm happy to be here today and hopefully share a little bit of wisdom that somebody will be able to take with them.
I love it. I love it. And then one thing you just touched upon there is the quantification of risk, right? I know we're kind of going off topic slightly, but it seems to be a thing that most cyber leaders struggle with. If you have any advice or hints and tips that you could offer in terms of what are the key things that your internal stakeholders may want to look at, and then kind of given that same angle towards like your executives within your company.
So I think there's a whole bunch of things that are going on. Risk is a big, complicated topic. I mean, especially cyber risk quantification just on its own, because I think that we need to align both qualified and quantified risk assessments. Because what's $1 million? Is that a critical risk? Is that low risk? You have to engage in that conversation, because if you're not engaged in the conversation, you don't know what you're talking about.
Yeah.
And so for me, that's really critical, and it's going to change over time or when you acquire businesses and things like that. But I also think that we need to look at risk very holistically. So even cybersecurity risk holistically. And by that, I mean, we need to look at the big picture. Like I'm a big fan of business impact analysis. And part of the reason is if you're doing it right, and by right, I'm going to mean you quantify the damage done to each part of the organization, which is to me the right thing to do. It's not required by any framework that I've worked with, but it is the right thing to do because then you're able to speak the language of the business. You know what the operational risk is. You know what's going to go down if a system goes down. And that's something the business is going to pay attention to. You've got to take a look at, the cyber insurance risks and all of those types of risks. And a lot of CISOs I know will go in and say, oh, here's the risk. And they put it out there and they say, do something. It's like, well, people don't do that. You can't take the inherent risk and claim that a 1 in 1,000-year event is what you should purchase towards. Yes, it's possible, but that is just not the likely scenario. Because the first thing you do when you talk to an executive, you say, here's the risk. The inherent risk is X. What do? They say, I don't believe you. It's true across the entire board. And I've seen some pretty severe cases or heard about the cases from the FBI and other events that I've been to. But you have to sit down and really work with them and really see that you're on their side to really understand what that risk is, tell stories, get the data. I'm very big on key performance indicators and taking a look at things like, I do like some of the stuff like zero trust and things, but you've got to take your whole program and tie into it and say, why do we have this risk? Why are you saying this is a high risk versus a low risk? Why are you putting that data in there? Because no is the first part of the conversation. And I enjoy no, because then you've got them engaged, and that's where you can have the discussion. I think that's one of the important things to do, because you can't just go in there screaming, hey, you've got $100 million risk, when it's highly unlikely, you know? So I think being reasonable, treating people with reason, say, look, and I do know that the cyber insurance agency area has a lot of problems. Got inherent risk simply isn't enough. I mean, it's a maximum expected loss, but one of the things that they're going through right now is they're trying to determine what is that. So they're starting to develop public-private partnerships to determine what is the risk in the extreme level. Because when you look at systemic cyber risk, an example of that is CrowdStrike that we saw just recently, which affected the globe. You know, it's huge. And so when you're trying to really understand the businesses and what type of risk it's going to be, you know, these are things that have to be taken into account. Risk is not a simple subject. You know, you've got to create the right business alignment in order to get people on board with those risks. So that's just a tiny recommendation, but I've got a lot more.
No. It's absolute sound advice. I think, the articulation of a risk, the actuality of it happening is something that people, I think, either under or overestimate. And I think the details matter, especially when it comes to them within their own designated business area, making it relatable to them, because, selfishly, they're only thinking of themselves. But then when you add in the complex layer above that, then those kind of jigsaw pieces come together. But yeah, very sound advice, Matthew. And I think it's a good description of, how you should be articulating risk in your organization. So in terms of back to your career, just talk me through some of the challenges you may have faced, and, and how you kind of effectively navigated them. Yeah.
Sure. So there's a whole bunch of challenges. Anybody who's been in cybersecurity has experienced challenges, period. And the CISO role is extraordinarily tough. Like I've not seen this, but I know somebody who they flubbed up a little bit on one of the tests, and he was thrown out on the curve. So there are a lot of people who know a lot of people, and there's been a lot of exits out of the cybersecurity arena lately, especially in the CISO role. So it's pretty common. I mean, even Ian said this year, in January of this year, that 75% of CISOs were looking at leaving their positions. Gartner, a year plus before, said 50% of CISOs were looking at leaving, and 25% were looking at getting out of the industry altogether. So there's been a lot of things, and a lot of it has to do with getting the appropriate resources. And that's really a tough thing, because I mean, in no company do you ever have sufficient resources. Nobody reaches a CMMI level 5 all the way across the board, across the entire organization. It just doesn't happen. It can happen, but is it really appropriate? Is it worth investing in that level? Well, maybe, but probably not. It depends on your risk profile, depends on the amount of data you're pulling in. It depends on a lot of different factors to really go that. But I personally have never seen a level 5, even amongst large organizations. So amongst sales, for example, I have been to very large banks and other kinds of organizations. Nobody is perfect. Everybody's got, some things that they've got to work on. That being said, a lot of it has to do with focusing on the culture level. A lot of it is having the right risk conversations and saying, look, here's what the risk is. Let's talk about it. Let's go into this. Let's see what that impact is going to be. And a lot of it is just telling stories over and over again. I like to tie the stories into key performance indicators and operational risk. So you start pulling all of those together, it changes the whole dynamic of that conversation. So I think that's incredibly important to do, because then they're like, okay, maybe you're right. Maybe we should start to consider multi-factor authentication on the VPN, or whatever the story might be. I'm just making up something. But those are some of the things that you do. It's something where you have to get to know the person, the people that you're working with. You have to get to know the CEO or the CIO and all these others. Go out to lunch with them. Go have a conversation. I've been more on the techie side. I've made mistakes myself. Everybody has. But that's how you learn. That's how you grow, and that's how you get to be a better person. But once you really start to connect with them, and you start to tell the stories, and you start to get the right people involved in the right types of meetings, and getting the buy-in prior to the meetings, especially if you're talking about risk governance or other sorts of things, that can be a huge win, because you've already got people on your side. So to me, that's incredibly valuable. And one of the things that I do is that culture can be such a kicker. It's a matter of how do you get past the culture, and connecting with people is one of the best ways that you can get past some of those cultural issues.
Yeah. And then in terms of obviously culture is massive, and I think either everyone cracks it first time or it takes a few iterations. And you've probably experienced this in your career, Matthew. Have you ever went to a place where the culture was just either non-existent or really bad? And I'm interested to know, how did you, I don't know, how did you use your wisdom, or how did you know, what types of approaches did you take to try and change that or steer that ship? Yeah.
So it depends. I mean, every culture has every culture that you walk into, every organization has its own culture.
Yeah.
Some of them, it's just not worth dealing with. I've dealt with some doozies that are out there, and sometimes you have to know when to run and be able to count your cards and say this is the best thing.
Yeah.
And CISOs today, I mean, given the fact that so many are leaving, you have to watch out for your own mental health. The organization doesn't care about it. You have to look out for yourself. And so seeing what's going on and seeing what the pressures are, understanding the pressures and having the right conversations is important. But I also think that having the right level of communication within the organization and the right org structure is incredibly important. So many org structures. I just had a conversation today. They brought it up to me. I didn't even bring it up. They said, "Yes, I was in an org. We got the security function out of IT, and all of a sudden things are better." To me, that's something I always advocate for, but it takes time. I mean, the reality is security is not really studied. It's something that you kind of grow into. Like, I didn't go to school for cybersecurity. I have got a master's degree in liberal studies, which has nothing to do with IT or cybersecurity, but it's where my passion is. I've got a lot of certifications along that route, but that just shows, and there's a good study by Cloudflare they did in, was it 2016 or 2014, just on the number of schools, at least in the United States, that offered cybersecurity courses or required them. It was abysmal. Out of the top
Yeah.
schools, very few people had that. So the place that you really learn cybersecurity is in the business environment, in companies that are really focusing on cybersecurity. So you've got to take those lessons learned, take all of it to heart and say, yep, I'll take my lumps, go in and explain where those challenges have been in other organizations in order to affect change. Because you can't affect change with, I've calculated the mathematics of this, believe me, it doesn't go anywhere. But telling those stories, I'm going to keep reiterating it, that's how you affect change.
I like that honesty. I think it's quite refreshing to hear. As you know, it's about understanding if it's going to work or if it's not, and then if you need to bounce, then then so be it. I think some people just kind of they double down, and then it's like after 2 years of trying, then they're burnt out, or there's maybe some other kind of event, or maybe they're strung up, and then they're kind of blamed for things that are actually a reflection of the overall company culture. And
Yeah.
these things can't be fixed unless you cleared out management, or I don't know, maybe other areas of an organization. But I like it. But yeah, in terms of our next segment would be a topic that you want to discuss that needs relevance and clearing up within the industry.
So I've kind of hinted towards that already, but I think one of the things that we really need to focus on, that security is not an IT issue. A lot of people think the role of security is IT. Now, what's interesting, you take a look at the first CIO, that was in the mid 80s. In 1995, because we had Steve Katz as the first CISO. Now, when you start to look at it, we have a long ways to go. We've always kind of we started out in the shadow of IT. So that has kind of persisted over a period of time. And there's not a lot of us, and it depends on the numbers. And I've seen a few things thrown around, but it's in the United States, there's less than 10,000 CISOs.
Well,
There's a lot of organizations, and a good chunk of those CISOs are going to be field CISOs. So they're working for other corporations trying to say, hey, buy our products because of X, Y, and Z. Or they're CISOs working for a managed security services provider, and they're saying, hey, buy our wares, we're the best. And, so those end up being sales agents. So I don't know the exact number. I don't know that anybody knows, but I would probably guess that the vast majority of them are focusing on that. But when you look at it, though, I think that's where a lot of the problems are, because part of what security does. So take something like a vulnerability management program, which is a very basic program. What should you do? How do you report that? A lot of CIOs don't like the fact that we've got to say, they're the knight in shining armor. They're telling the business how fantastic they are. And we're like, oh, absolutely, you are fantastic. But we got a little issue over here to take care of. It's annoyance. We're going in there and sort of ribbing them, saying, hey, there's an issue to take care of. Now, that's good governance, but it doesn't always make for good friends when you're going through and working with things. So if you're trying to create that connection, it can be a challenge for a lot of organizations. And what's interesting too, when you look at that, I put out a poll out on LinkedIn. Only 3 people responded. I'd love to tell you it's 1,000 people, but it isn't. But it was 3 people. But I said, what percentage of, and I focused on CIOs, and I said, for CIOs, what percentage of the problems do you sweep under the carpet when talking to the business? 2 of those people said between 50 and 75% of the problems they sweep under the carpet.
Wow.
1 person said between 25 and 50%. Now, I don't know the exact numbers. This is not a good poll, but I think from what I've observed, from talking to people, from seeing the general problems, I think that it's not unrealistic, those numbers that I saw out there.
Yeah.
And again, that's just looking through a lot of different groups and a lot of different conversations that I've had over the years, a lot of things that I've witnessed and so on. But I think that really tells, like, if you are a business person and you want to get the truth for what's going on, you've got to have somebody on the outside. So take like internal audit. And I have a lot of respect for the internal auditors out there. There's, from a Venn diagram, depending on the org, it's going to be between 10% to 30% overlap with cybersecurity for the work that they do. They've got a lot of other stuff on their plate, but they are independent, and then they're assessing all these other parts of the organization, which to me are good KPIs to work with, key performance indicators. And I think that stuff like that, and we need to look at how we do things. So if we're going to report, hey, we've got all these vulnerabilities, all these problems, and they're not being cleaned up, cool. And there are some other ways you can get into EPSS, and there's a huge conversation you can get into just on that topic alone. But you need a way from a governance standpoint to say, hey, we've got KPIs. I just put out something yesterday just on this particular topic in the business and looking at KPIs. And the challenge is, businesses, they know what their financial KPIs are. They know if the business is staying afloat. They know if it's going down, if it's going up. They get this general idea. And there's a lot of financial KPIs. We are not developing those same KPIs from a cybersecurity perspective. They aren't even going, where are you, or where are we at? They aren't checking with the CIOs. They aren't checking with the CISOs. And that to me is really problematic. So you've got a group, some of them will. I'm sure there's a lot that don't, because you have to have good governance in a lot of places, and you have to have that open communication. But if they're sweeping things under the carpet, you're never going to allow those KPIs to come to surface. And so I think business leaders need to do that. But here's the other thing. I have met a lot of CIOs and others that are like, you know what? I don't want the business to see what's going on for our incident response plan or disaster recovery plan. They don't want to see this stuff. So business leaders don't know that. They should know that, but they don't know that in many cases. Now, the better organizations, they're involved in that. Now, if the CEO was come down and pound their fist and like, you failed in this, or you could have been better here. Wrong attitude. Be thankful that you're part of that and say, what can I do to help you? I recognize that. I know we've got 50 million things going on. What can we do to improve if there's a problem? And I think that's a better approach. So I think that when you look at the whole group and the challenges of problems, it stems to a lot of these things, what's going on between the C-level networks and the board of directors and some of these others. I've seen CEOs even change like risk registers and all of those types of things that are meddling, and I don't think that risk is that high. And they want to jump in there like, well, I do think that it's that high. Here's why. And then and it can be a huge, long process, but you're getting in the way of governance. Now, if it's a case that you have the time to sit down and discuss every single one of these and do a deep dive on every single little risk that you're tying into, great. But you need a chief risk officer for that. If that's your role as a CISO, how are you managing everything else? So I think the businesses really do need to understand what that big picture is. And just saying no is not sufficient, and really start to understand that, look, like IT, I think, figured out a long time ago, we're here for the business. We're here to support that business. Business, you wanted all this. This is what it's costing you. Is it a worthwhile to consider what's the return on investment, or ROCE in the security, return on security investment. So that is positive. I think that's a really good, healthy approach that CIOs are taking. I do think that CISOs should have that same mentality. They need to go in there when you've got a meeting. You need to be in there with the business meeting, understanding what the business is going through, because you need to communicate with the business. If you're not communicating with the business, you're not there for the business. What are you there for?
I
So
absolutely
those are
agree.
just a few.
Yeah.
Go ahead.
No, no, please continue.
My point was mostly done, but basically I was just saying that's where security needs to be today. And I think there's a evolution that's starting to go on. There was a report that came out just recently, said something like 30% of the CISOs are no longer reporting into an IT function. They're reporting into a business function. So if you think about it back to 1985 and now, it may seem small. I think that's huge. I think
Yeah.
that's really huge. So, but anyway, you
I
had a
think,
question.
no, I was going to say, I think just to that last point there, I think it's now becoming very, very relevant. I think you're right. Being able to tell a story, obviously, KPIs only give you a risk measure and I don't know, a number. But the evolution of KPRs moving into OKRs, for
Yeah.
audience, OKRs helps tell a story. It's got an objective and basically stretch goals. And I feel like with specific C-level individuals, that actually goes a long way because you can actually add in the KPI indicators within the OKRs. So then they can clearly
Yes.
see what's your main objective, what are your stretch goals, and what percentages do we need to hit. Then you've got your RAG status and everything else behind it. But I think
Yeah, I agree.
based 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 on your topic that you've chosen, do you think education can help? Like if we educate more people, then that changes perception of security. And also, I think vendors could play a huge part in this. You mentioned there's 10,000 CISOs in the US. I think, the more education, I'm not saying we overload people with information, but I think the more we take the business on a journey, that then will mean that, security will belong in its right place. It'll be in a business function. It will be able to listen and understand the business objective. So then we can align and scale with the business rather than being the old-fashioned isolated group in the corner. So, but I'm interested, is that something that you've seen or a trend that's perhaps changing?
Um, yeah, I think that's a big part of it. I mean, you mentioned the key word that I'm big on, alignment. I use the word align, but alignment. Um, and to me, that is absolutely critical. We have to be aligned with the business. So when you make a connection with somebody, you understand where they're at. You use their same metaphors. They're like, oh, you got it. Oh, this person's a rugby fan or soccer
Yeah.
fan or whatever it is. If you understand at least some of the metaphors, you may not have to be an expert in what they're talking about, but at least you're able to use that in a way that's going to resonate. They're not only going to like it, but there's a better chance that they're going to go along with that. So I do think education is part of that. That's something that I'm doing too, is I'm working with executives to educate them, whether it's a board of directors, COO, CEO, whatever, talking about cybersecurity. What is it? There's a lot of misconceptions that are out there related to cybersecurity. And a lot of, and that's something I think that education will start to change over time. It's just going to take, it's going to take a lot of effort in order to make those changes, though. It's not something that's, snap, we're done, we're going to get this. But it's kind of like changing a religion, because you think about it, today's leaders, they've grown up where security is underneath IT, and that's just the traditional model that you're working with. So they just make the assumption that's where security belongs. But security doesn't belong down in that box. We need to be educators. We need to be doing the education. That's part of the OKRs, KPIs, et cetera, that you're talking about. But also get into storytelling to try to do that and try to get those allies across the board to make changes within organizations. And I think that's one of the key things, whether you're going to be working with that. I do think that in the schools today, I even work with some startups. Some of them really get it. They understand how severe the situation is. Everybody's been talking about Joe Sullivan and Tim Brown and things like that too. I think that's adding to the stress and some of the CISOs leaving, because that was, the Security Exchange Commission is calling up Tim Brown specifically, and SolarWinds, but I was glad to see that part of that case was thrown out because it was nailing them. And who's responsible at that point? Really, if you're a CISO and you say, hey, here's a problem. We've got this massive gap. Can I please have some funding? And they're saying no. Well, then you become the risk owner. So within an organization, defining the ownership and defining what's going on, defining where you're going to block things, that becomes extraordinarily important. Whether you're working with a CFO, CIO, whatever the story is, if they're coming in and saying no, that becomes a problem too. And there's a balance point that's got to reach. There are some organizations that I've heard about where the security department just says no to everything. And so being a department of no, is not the right approach. One of the clients I'd worked with ages ago came up with the phrase work towards yes.
Yeah.
And I thought that was absolutely brilliant. We need to work towards yes, because what are people going to do? You don't give them a way to work, they're going to find a way to work around it. AI is just the latest example of that. I mean, to me, it's just an external third-party system that can be compromised just like any other third-party system that's out there. But if you don't give them a way to work, they're going to put stuff up there and utilize it. So if you block it, they're going to start going on their home system and working off their home system. You got to put that data up there because they can work faster. And then it's like the data is not only not in the corporate network, but it's on another network someplace else. And if that gets compromised and you're not aware of the data, it's a problem. And so when you've got, thousands and thousands of different AIs that are out there, I don't even know how many AI companies are out there these days. It's like, well, I like this one and I like this one. I like this one. Like, there's a lot to go into a decision like that. And there are companies who take the extreme or draconian approach. We're blocking everything. We're going to buy an AI and you're going to use it and that's it. Other ones are going to vet it and say, here's why we're not going to allow it, but we're going to block it. But people are going to be people. And it's like, well, this is slowing me down. Well, can't you leave? Some people are going to be stalwarts and they're not going to move, but others are going to be like, all right, let me give it a shot. Oh, okay. That's okay. That's not perfect, but at least I'm able to get some progress there. So I think a lot of things like that are very important in terms of educating others, but also observing behavior. If that the Department of No does not work in many cases, but you have to kind of be careful with it too, because you can't be total. Like one of the organizations I'm aware of, they use the phrase guardrails, not gates, which on one level is really appealing, but on the other level, I still believe in the trust but verify. I have seen organizations where, I hate to pick on vulnerability management again, but they're not paying attention to it. And all of a sudden things just fall apart. Those silos that you spoke about earlier are one of the big dangers of cybersecurity. And so if you move it off to the side and work with that a little bit and say, hey, it looks like we don't have agents on these systems. And I found that out there. Oh, we were just building that because of X, Y, or Z. Great. There's still vulnerabilities and we don't want persistence. You don't even have antivirus on it. Okay, well, maybe we should take a different approach. So there's all kinds of different things that can be done from an education standpoint, but you still need to have some sort of verification where you can't just be completely hands off and trusting, because what happens just exactly in those organizations, you end up with risks that you're not even aware of. And so there's got to be this balancing point. So when you're looking at, like, one of the big concepts I'm really big on is assurance. Somebody's doing something. And the thing is, the reality is you get some people that are fantastic. There's some people I know that no matter what, they're going to do 100% the right thing. And they are a complete and total joy to work with. And I've loved working with them. They're going to teach me things that I don't know. Like, bring it. This is what I like. And this is a healthy organization. And I love it. But there are others who are like, it's a pain. I don't want to deal with it. And that's where you end up. You've got to do a little bit more work. And sometimes that can be that act of observation can be huge. It can be transformative. So like in one case, I was working with a group within IT. They had just the worst out there. Like, well, we don't need to do this because of this. And they want to get rid of like 50 findings out of their particular area. And this is a very tough audit. This is not like a minor audit. So they had a lot of different findings. And finally, they wrote me like a 3-page thing. And I found the one sentence that I cared about in the entire thing and said, this is what I'm focusing on. But this is not going to solve or get rid of the findings. And it's also a risk. And here's why. And then had a meeting on it. And I CC'd this person's manager. And I'll tell you, they got it. And then we had to do a follow-up conversation or two, but they started getting it like, oh, now I understand. Now we get it. they ended up being the best group. I stopped paying attention to them to the same degree that I paid attention to others, because after a couple of audits and I knew who that whole team over there, it was fantastic. So I loved it. So to me, that's a good success story when it comes to, kind of monitoring what's going on, trust but verify, and that goes into that assurance model. So there's a lot of things to be said for education, but sometimes bumping your head against the wall is a really positive thing.
Hi, everyone. I wanted to take a couple of minutes and talk about today's sponsor, which is Vanta. Whether you're starting or scaling your company's security program, demonstrating top-notch security practices and establishing trust is more important than ever. Through my experiences of using Vanta, Vanta automates compliance. It covers everything from SOC 2, ISO 27001, HIPAA, and many more, saving you time and money, while helping you build customer trust. I love all the insights that it gives me, covering everything from asset management, my control failures, audit status, even vulnerabilities from other connecting systems which have been integrated into the platform. Having a centralized place for something like an ISO program has been a godsend for me. Plus, you can streamline security reviews by automating questionnaires and demonstrating your security posture with a customer-facing trust center, all powered by Vanta AI. Why Vanta? With over 7,000 global companies like Atlassian, Flow Health, and Quora, they all use Vanta to manage risk and provide security in real time. So, my listeners can claim a special offer of $1,000 off Vanta at vanta.com/decloaked. That's vanta.com/decloaked. Thanks.
Absolutely, because then I think it scatters the brain, right? Metaphorically, then that allows you to, back to your point, observe why these things aren't clicking. Maybe simply they have a different business objective or priority. Then I think a lot of the time people just need to be told what's wrong and how to fix it. Then they're quite happy to work with you. And I think also if you're willing to offer that support, that psychological safety, the likelihood is they're going to want to work together and resolve the situation. And again, if you gamify it, I know a lot of people that's come on the podcast, they're really big into gamification. And then that then kind of inspires folk to kind of take a bit of pride. And then next thing you know, you've created a monster and people, in your organization fighting against each other because they want to be the best. And, but we also need to factor in that people are really busy. Cybersecurity is still a new thing. We're not taught this in school, back to your point earlier. It's still relatively new, and I guess we need to educate. But I completely agree. And then on to our last segment, Matthew, is the one thing in cyber do you think is BS and needs a focus and needs to change?
So I was thinking through this, and there are a lot of things that are out there, but I think the number one thing is that it goes back to that Tim Brown case that I was talking about, is the responsibility of the CISO for all things cyber. If you've got a mountain or you need to build the metaphorical Taj Mahal, and you've got two people, can you build the Taj Mahal? Probably not. If you go to the business and say, look, I'd like to build the Taj Mahal, they're like, no. If the Taj Mahal isn't built, is that the responsibility of the CISO? Here's the resources I need. Here's the business case. Here's why we need to do it. And that to me is important, because that's exactly when you read through what Tim Brown was going through. There are a lot of assessments that were done. Those assessments were saying, hey, we've got these gaps. And what's interesting, you take a look at their website, they said, we follow NIST CSF. Now, NIST CSF has, I'm going to loosely call them controls. It's very weak, but it doesn't say that it meets NIST CSF. It said that it follows NIST CSF. So that's a big distinction. When you get into the specifics, because they were trying to go towards FedRAMP, there are a ton of requirements. Depending on how you want to break them up, because there's a lot of different ways, it could be over 1,000 requirements. I've seen some estimates, 1,500, when you break out the requirements and the sub-requirements within the requirements. It's really an intense framework when you start to look at, depending on how you want to break it up. But when you do that, and then you say, hey, we've got all of these issues, I don't have time to stay on top of all of this. And then the IT department, because when security grows, IT needs to grow. You need people to do the remediation. You know, if you're doing just straight patch management for Windows and maybe add in, Chrome or, Adobe Acrobat or something like that, just the basics, you're not doing enough, but it's a really good start. That's a great platform, but you've got a lot more to do. And so, but you have to have both security and IT saying, look, we're going to need more resources for this. We don't have the ability. We acknowledge the risk. Both of us are on the same team. Here's the risk. Here are the things that we can do. Can we please have some money and then see what the business say? Now, in some cases, the business can't afford it. You know what? Cool. But if you have the CEO signing off on the risk, or the COO or whatever's appropriate for the organization signing off on the risk, you've done a day's work. You've at least got their buy-in. Now, this isn't a guarantee, of course. Like not an organization I was with, but an organization I observed and was working with in a tangential sense. They had a CEO who would literally sign off on critical risk. Oops, critical risk, great. I'll accept responsibility. Critical risk. So at that point, you've got a yes machine. There's no point having a security person in there educating you on all this stuff because you're going to sign off on every single risk. And so if there's no boundary for what you're going to sign off on, you know what? Don't even have a CISO at that point. I felt so bad for that particular person. I can't remember if they were in the CISO or director or whatever, the senior security role. That's a bad situation to be in. I personally would walk away from a situation like that because even though they're taking responsibility, I'm useless. I'd make a few cases. I talk about it. I, bring in CRQ. I would talk, do what I can. I tell stories, but if they're okay with it, like they don't want to hear it, I'm happy to sign off and accept risk. They are accepting responsibility, and that acceptance of responsibility, I think, is very critical. But at least from a process perspective, I was thrilled, to see that. And I was very happy for the senior security person in that particular case.
I think after that sign-off process, a lot of CISOs or people responsible for security in an organization, they take it personal. They can't switch off because I think they clearly understand the magnitude of the risk. They understand the probability of it happening. They also, they're like a clairvoyant. It's almost like, I've been in situations where I've spoke with peer groups and, I won't mention anyone at any companies, and they've told me they've had CEOs stick their fingers in their ears, literally, because they don't want to hear it. And it's like, I don't think at times maybe people who sign off on risk understand the legal issues. In some cases, it could be massive fines, it could be imprisonment, it could be a whole host of things, that impacts your share price, your next round of investment, multitude of different things. But, back to Tim Brown, I think people, when it comes to regulators or people that obviously call Tim Brown up for obviously the legal stuff, it's almost like they forget that security is a program of work. It's not a silver bullet. Back to your points earlier, it's not entirely perfect. And, there may have been things where, people like Tim or people that, maybe in the future are in a position where you delegate to the business, you're handing that off, the accepted responsibility to risk. But then it becomes an aspect of bureaucracy, the execution of it fails, people are busy, or there's a lack of buy-in, or it just simply comes down to maybe through that kind of life cycle where things don't get done. I know people who have worked with organizations and it's taken them years to get patch management.
I believe it.
It's like, what do you do? Do you try and educate? But then it's like, when you're dealing with that kind of side of an organization that, we hear about it so many times where a company's like a 10 years old, 15 years old, and they've never even looked at security. Or you get another, you get another AI
I'm
startup.
working with more than one company that way. They have a director of security. From a CMMI perspective, they're not even one, and they just never did anything proactive.
Or maybe they're just, their knowledge is limited to like one domain. and they forget everything else. Like you obviously you have like endpoint, boundary control, zero trust you've mentioned earlier. These things are just beyond their skill set or comprehension. Then when you try to articulate that to an organization, they're like, what the hell is a zero trust network? What the hell does this mean? I've been in multiple investment conversations, and obviously you're going for the next round of funding, or you're maybe mentoring a company going through that, or they've called you in, and it's like the security is now being asked at an investment round, whether that's pre-seed, series A, B, whatever it may be. People aren't going to give you a check if they think you're not secure. I mean, it would be absolute suicide. Then you'll see like lots of these AI companies getting big rounds of funding. Then you have like the CTO of OpenAI who doesn't even know where the data comes from. There's a very famous interview of that. It's a car crash.
Yeah.
No offense to our friends at OpenAI, but it's like, that then, if engineers are watching that, people in an organization, they're going to go, oh my God, that kind of erodes trust. And then that ties back to things like security. But yeah, anyway, I've gone in an absolute tangent there. But I think, yeah, risks advance as well. The more and more technology you on board, more and more SaaS or whatever it may be, that's when security needs to scale as well. But I don't think people still quite grasp that when it comes to when your risk grows, your capability needs to match that to then defuse the bomb or reduce that blast radius. But yeah, I'm interested to get your kind of final thoughts on that, Matthew. Yeah.
Yeah, no, I mean, I totally agree with you. It is shareholder value to have good security. And I will say, I run into PE firms all the time, and I talk with them. There's some really good work that they're doing, so I have a lot of respect for the approach that they're taking. And I do work with some startups too. And some of them are really taking cybersecurity seriously. Some of them will listen to somebody else. Hey, I like somebody. And then they say, "Oh, we're good. We did multi-factor authentication. Our cloud is secure." Oh boy,
Yeah.
Let's talk about the S3 bucket. There's a ton of things to go into, and so that's one of the challenges. If you're a CEO and you don't have the background in IT, you don't have the background in cybersecurity, you might be fooled saying, "Yeah, MFA, we're protected. We're 100% protected. We're good," not understanding the risks that are associated with native cloud tools. I was actually in a situation once. I'm talking with the CIO, and I said, the S3 bucket is something that your team is going to use. He thought I was insane for even mentioning it. Nobody in their right mind would use that. No IT person. About a week or two later, we brought in somebody who was talking about the cloud and the setup, and they used the S3 bucket.
Yeah.
So then I just kind of looked over and said, he knew what I was saying without me saying a word. But it is starting to impact organizations. I mean, when you look at the threat landscape, I mean, right now, the cost of cybercrime is above 10 trillion from more than one source that's out there who's assessing this. That's larger than the GDP of US and China. There's no other source that's out there that's as big when it comes to crime. In 4 years, some of the estimates I've seen could be double. And, even 10 years ago, I was saying that major APT actors, advanced persistent threat actors, are compromising every organization on the planet. Well, you know what? Medium-sized businesses, small businesses, others go after it. Advertising the amount of data you have on your website, not a good idea, because then they're like, oh, they're a gold mine. Why don't I go for them? Especially over here in the United States, we have health data. It's called protected health information. And that's a real gold mine there too. When you look at all this stuff, and some companies are pulling in the data and using it in all kinds of ways. I mean, you don't see a day that goes by without hearing about some breach of some company. It is endless. I mean, you could have a job where you just put stuff up on social media and say, breach, 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 breach. It's just insane how much is going on when you look at this globally. And some of this is just looking at things from the US perspective. But when you look at this stuff globally, it is massive what's going on. And I'm sure a lot of stuff is not reported. I'm sure the problems are much worse than we know about today. So I agree with you. I mean, So one of the things that I do in CRQ, and there's a lot to this, but I calculate the value of your cybersecurity program. And there's multiple ways of doing that. Because one of the things I didn't mention earlier, when you're getting into CRQ, you want to get into the value of it. Are you considering how much business enablement is going on from having a solid cybersecurity program? Some organizations, for example, are going to make sure that you get the proper data governance. I mean, the whole slew of privacy regulations, not only in the US, but around the globe, are having a massive impact about how we do business in other countries and other companies. Because if you've got that data and it's sensitive, you're handing it off to a third party. And this is a really common thing. For those who don't know, this is very normal business practice. Data is the new gold or new oil, whichever metaphor you want to use. It's being used all over the place. And so if you're not even keeping track about how your third parties are doing things, and what's interesting, when you look at a lot of the contracts that I've been working with over the years, and this is not true in all industries, so some of you might say, I've never seen that, and to be 100% right. But they're asking to see what's going on in your organization. They want to be able to assess it, understand that data flow, understand where the data is going and which companies they're going to, and they want to see your third-party risk program. And third-party risk is something really important to pay attention to. So the strongest case I've ever seen is all security decisions are coming through our company and we're acting as your CISO. Now, I've only seen that once, but I imagine it's out there in other cases. But when you're looking at the data, many companies are taking this extraordinarily seriously. They need to understand the value of third-party risk. Like, I'm a huge fan of some of the big companies that do the scans externally and say, oh, here's your risk. But when you consider the larger risk for the organization, like we saw Change Healthcare here in the United States, that was a third-party risk. You know, it's something somebody else had gained access to it to move it, and that was a big problem right there. So if you're looking at it, do you know all the software that's coming in? And I've worked with some financial organizations, and every single time there's any type of incident, do you have this software? What did you do? What was your response? Did you contain it? Did you detect this? And then it's like, it's endless and ongoing, because the reality is the scanning tools don't go into those kind of questions. And this is why third-party risk is getting more and more expensive. Security is getting more and more expensive across the board for organizations today. So I think sometimes these surveys are really important to go into to kind of understand, you know, what's the risk tolerance and appetite related to some of these tools. And some of them are widely used, highly respected products that are out there, but that third-party risk, like nobody expected the CrowdStrike incident. Nobody. It was terrible. But, you know, now it's like you're starting to ask, well, what do you do in situations like this? How much of this is farmed out to third parties for what you're doing? And if they are third parties, like the Delta case here, a lot of the airline went down, and some of the talk that I've seen online had to do with their outsourcing a lot of their work to other companies, which happened to be using CrowdStrike, which then went down. So then they couldn't do the appropriate response, and it took a lot longer for them to deal with the outage than it did some of the other airlines. And so there's questions about going on. There's a lot of nasty stuff going on, but it allows us to change the conversation to resilience. I think that resilience is such an important conversation. And this is where you bring in those business impact analysis. This is where you bring into account all of these other things. But, you know, how as a company, what do you do for a situation like this? How are you going to respond? You know, are you using, if you go back to Change Healthcare, great. We're using Change Healthcare, cool. Do we have an alternate? Because this is a mission critical tool within your organization. And that's one of the ways that I think the CISOs can bring in a lot of value to their organizations, is by being broader and thinking about things from a business perspective. And I think that's what we need to do today, is really be more business focused as CISOs. And I think that's going to have a tremendous impact on our ability to focus on things and just recognize that we're going to need a lot of education. We're going to have to tell stories for stuff that we're seeing in the media. You know, hey, here's what happened here. Here's what happened here. Because usually if there's some incident comes out, a lot of CEOs I've worked with say, hey, what's going on with this? Hey, what's going on with that? And then they want an answer right there. Like, it just came out today, this morning at 7 a.m. I haven't had time yet. And it's like, you're an idiot for not knowing. You know, so, okay, great. Let me dive into it a little bit until you check it if you're like riding on the train or something like that, or try to listen to a podcast or something. But, you know, not always is there an answer right away. It's like, well, you have to accept the risk because we need time to figure out the problem. And so that's where you get into the vector analysis and all these other things. You try to look at, hey, here's a new variable that's going into things. You can't just snap your fingers and magically get everything done, and I think that's one of the big challenges of our age, is we definitely need teams focusing on these things. It can't just be the CISO by him or herself. I've got the answer, because that doesn't work. You need to have a holistic approach to cybersecurity and a holistic approach to education. And it's creating a team where you're going to create a safe environment. And it's okay to say, I don't know. Like, I'm a big fan of I don't know. Let me look into that. That's very respectable. I know from some cultural perspectives, saying that would be terrible, but that's my opinion. We have to feel okay with saying, I don't know, I will research it. It's a top priority.
Excellent and sound advice as always, Matthew. And yeah, we'll wrap up the episode. And again, thank you so much for your time, Matthew. And to our audience, please like, subscribe, and share. And yeah, thanks again, Matthew. I appreciate it.
Thank you.